Chosen one, family, lean in. Room full of originals, heavy with purpose and proof. I can feel it from here. Not timid hearts, not shaky voices, giants waking up in real time. Plans were drafted against this moment, but presence outranks paperwork every single time. The masks, the rehearsed warmth, the shiny invitations? Cute. Discernment read the fine print before the ink dried. This is not a pep talk, this is ignition. We're naming the pattern, tracing the wires, and cutting the power where the trap thought it had you cornered. No glitter, no fluff, no pretending. Just clarity that steadies the hands and courage that refuses the script. If the room had a heartbeat, it would be drumming on assignment right now. Hear this. Softness is not weakness, and peace is not passivity. That stillness you carry? It's calibrated strength. That smile. It's the headline that says, I'm 5 steps ahead. They expected panic. They're getting precision. They expected tears. They're getting testimony. They expected collapse. They're getting a rise so clean it looks like sunrise. So take your space. Roll your shoulders back. Call your spirit to attention. Tonight we're unpacking the setup, exposing the system, and walking out with strategy. Real, usable, today's strategy. No begging for a seat at tables that wobble. We build, we bless, we move. Ready? Say it with your chest. I was built for this. Lights up. No fear. No shrinking. Let's get to work, looking for purpose and peace. Hit subscribe and start the journey. Gentle strength isn't a gap in intellect. It's disciplined clarity wearing soft edges. They mistook quiet attention for empty thought. Because you let conversations breathe and didn't rush to fill the air, they filed you under simple, convinced that patience meant dullness. They watched you give grace to people who hadn't earned it and decided that mercy equals gullibility. What they never accounted for was the way your mind kept ledgers. Small entries, time-stamped, odd pauses, mismatched stories, voices that rose half a note when a truth should have settled flat. You weren't nodding along. You were surveying terrain. While they stitched alibis with bright thread, you traced the seamwork, finger on each knot. You marked the detours others missed, the subtle rewordings, the jokes that landed a shade off, the sudden policy changes in their behavior. You let silence do the sorting. You didn't rush the proof. You let patterns mature. Not because fear held your tongue, but because timing is a tool. You knew that a premature challenge would hand them an escape hatch, noise, denial, theatrics. So you let their story accrue interest. They thought they were steering you with small performances. Meanwhile, you were calibrating instruments. You clocked cadence and context like a watchmaker reading misaligned gears, noting where the motion snagged. You cataloged tells, not the obvious ones, the tiny ones. How a gaze skimmed at the exact moment a claim should have landed. How a memory came back too polished. You played conversation like a long horizon. Lighthouse first, harbor last. Feel God's love stirring within you? Don't let it stop there. Hit the super thank you button and sow a seed of $20 or more. That simple act can ignite hope, heal hearts, and carry His love further than you imagine. You were made to shine His light. This is your moment. Be the miracle someone's been praying for. Let heaven move through you. When you finally moved, it wasn't a slam of doors, it was an audit. Numbers reconciled. Timelines snapped into place. A single question set dominoes you'd aligned weeks ago into motion, and the picture assembled itself without a raised voice. No spectacle. No gloating. Precision did the work. The same softness they mocked became the cushion that kept your hand steady. No shaking, no mess. Just facts arranged so cleanly that excuses ran out of oxygen. You didn't set out to win a shouting match. You designed a room where only coherence could stand. And once the room existed, their stories had nowhere to sit. They realized the scale of what you'd been noticing. Not one loose thread, but the loom. That's why their anger curdled into worry. If you caught this, what else did your patience log? Which moments did you place in the vault, waiting for the hour when they would be needed? They expected a storm. They met a mirror. They hoped to bait you into chaos. You answered with sequence. They gambled that kindness meant you couldn't count. You counted everything. And now that the math has been shown, the fear isn't the sum you revealed. It's the unknown remainder you chose not to solve out loud. Patience was strategy, not blindness. The sequence wasn't allowed to run because of confusion. It was allowed to run because every click, pause, and pivot mattered. Step by step, the pattern rendered itself like a photograph in a darkroom, contrast rising until denial had nowhere to hide. Cutting in early would have granted an easy rewrite. The usual theatrics, the counterfeit fog, the labels meant to shrink reality. So the process was permitted to complete, not to be lured, but to let the record become self-authenticating. The tells multiplied, sympathy that arrived on schedule, generosity that asked for witnesses, curiosity that skimmed instead of listened. The current behind their phrases didn't match the surface, and that mismatch was logged, calmly, repeatedly. Make your impact eternal. Join now, and be a light in someone's darkness. Interruption would have scattered the proof. Stillness let it settle. No alarms, no chase, just the quiet work of alignment, like balancing an equation until both sides can be read by anyone. When the moment came, a single precise inquiry was enough. Timelines reconciled, claims cross-checked, and the picture stabilized without spectacle. The irony burned on its own. The elaborate arrangement looped back to its architect. Rage followed not because of injury done to them, but because there was no exit hatch left. Too many specifics, too much consistency, not enough air for excuses. The conclusion required no raised voice and no victory lap. A steady pulse, a clear door, and an unhurried departure were sufficient. The display they staged for your fall became the ledger of their choices, and the only collapse was the story they could no longer edit. Their playbook was written for a person who no longer exists. The design didn't miss the mark by accident. It targeted an archive. Old measurements, old reflexes, old softness that once bartered peace for presence. That was the template. Meanwhile, the internal system had been refitted offstage. Permissions tightened, boundaries patched, instincts sharpened by lessons they themselves provided. They ran tactics that assumed yesterday's settings, sugar-coated vows, rehearsed concern, appeals to guilt, bargains that trade silence for belonging. The key they forged once fit. The lock has changed. The bait relied on nostalgia. The organism now treats it like a harmless echo. When the expected compliance didn't arrive, the framework buckled. They anticipated explanations, apologies, self-doubt on loop. Instead, they met decisions made without ceremony. No bargaining, no re-entry, just alignment with the person formed after the last ending. Their confusion isn't mystery, it's latency. They coded for an obsolete release, and then argued with the update. That is why the scheme unraveled. A net thrown at a shadow can't catch what stands in daylight. Endurance did more than survive. It rewired preferences, upgraded standards, and closed the ports where flattery once slipped through. And the safeguard over your life, call it providence, call it mercy, kept the mismatch intact. Their design never interfaced with the strength built quietly, where no audience was invited. They tried to mine your history for leverage, sorting through old embarrassments and half-healed memories, like scavengers, convinced yesterday could pilot today. They banked on familiar reflexes, on the flinch, the freeze, the rush to make it right at your own expense. They rehearsed references to family fractures and quiet rooms where your voice once folded, expecting you to go dim on cue. They charted your patterns, filed your fears, ran calculations on where the pressure used to split you. What they didn't budget for was the audit you ran on yourself. You mapped triggers with care, not to exploit but to mend. You practiced steadiness until your pulse stopped bargaining with noise. While they engineered a scene for the version of you who chased closure, you constructed a life that doesn't require their permission slip. Validation was outsourced to nothing, and no one that feel God's love stirring within you? Don't let it stop there. Hit the super thank you button and sow a seed of $20 or more. That simple act can ignite hope, heal hearts, and carry His love further than you imagine. You were made to shine His light. This is your moment. Be the miracle someone's been praying for. Let heaven move through you. A private foundation, built in still mornings and long evenings, carried what they never thought to measure. You turned corners they never noticed, tuning your attention to signals beneath language. Motive, congruence, trajectory. No debate needed. No raised temperature. Just the kind of composure that unsettles anyone who can't yank your center off its axis. Their plan requested the old passcode. The system declined. They used what they recognized. You answered with what they refused to learn. And when impact time arrived, their scheme sputtered. All trigger, no ignition. An elaborate device that couldn't fire because the target had already been rebuilt. Clutter at the edges wasn't the issue. The origin was. They expected you to duel the faces in front of you. But you tracked the pattern beyond the front line. Past distractions, past rehearsed conversations, past synchronized entrances that kept arriving right when doubt would serve them best. The timing repeated. The phrasing recycled. The choreography felt manufactured. You started reading the watermark beneath the ink. Not just actions, but who or what benefited when certain stories spread. Not just a nudge, but the hand that funded the nudge. While others tangled with the drama, you studied architecture. Some participants weren't piloting their choices. They were echoing prompts sourced elsewhere, borrowed scripts, borrowed urgency, borrowed outrage, that explained the precision of the hits and the eerie familiarity of the sequence. Instead of wrestling every slight, you widened the frame and watched the current arrange its pieces. Once the current was named, the mask of randomness slipped. You recognized an organized campaign, not a messy accident, and you declined the unpaid job of fixer. Strategy replaced reaction. Clear boundaries stated once. Rituals of focus that kept your attention clean. Exits taken without ceremony or resentment. The moment the hidden conductor is visible, the symphony of confusion can't keep tempo. You didn't merely sidestep manipulation. You diagrammed the network, pushing it forward. That's why the noise spiked when you didn't break. Terror doesn't come from your survival. It comes from your sight. Games collapse when the operator is in full view, and you watch the whole circuit light up. Make your impact eternal. Join now and be a light in someone's darkness. Their delivery came preloaded, phrases cued, expressions synchronized, concern turned on like a switch, and to outsiders it passed inspection. Behind that polish, the routine was obvious. Roles swapped as needed, narratives nudged into place. Outcomes engineered to tilt against you while feigning loyalty. What they didn't calculate was that the pattern had already been decoded. Quiet signals arrived months before any confrontation. Those sudden inner alerts, those midnight clarities, the subtle drift in tone that refuses to be misread. Tangible proof wasn't available at first, but the confirmation inside never wavered. So observation replaced interruption. No early alarm, no scramble. The sequence was allowed to complete so denial would have nowhere to stand. Fabricated crumbs appeared, staged coincidences, curated chatter, suggestive trails designed to point at you. None of it required panic. Truth keeps its own schedule, and you honored it. Emotional detachment happened long before the finale. Attention withdrew while they assumed they still held it. When the last beat landed, there was no ceremony, no approval granted, no outrage offered, just exit. Their production tried to draft you into a story you never agreed to inhabit, and once you recognized the storyboard, the page turned without noise. Stillness was timing disguised as quiet. The shift was unmistakable. Cadence off by half a step, warmth replaced by calculation, gaps where spontaneity should live. That awareness wasn't panic, it was calibrated sensitivity. Rather than rush, proximity was permitted. They stepped closer. Confident the hush meant surrender. It meant counting. Movements were logged, collaborations mapped, inconsistencies time-stamped. The goal wasn't to strike first, but to choose the exact hinge, where the whole door comes free. No speeches. No premature exposure. The outline had to solidify until even their defenders would see it. And when the architecture stood in full view, action arrived without warning. A single, precise decision that cut power at the main, leaving the side circuits useless. In moments, the edifice they'd been assembling collapsed under its own design. Shock followed because they mistook patience for sleep. They expected more room to maneuver, more chances to polish a cover story, more time to harvest advantage. Instead, the source was located and the signal silenced. That quiet wasn't fear. It was alignment with insight. What stings isn't defeat by accident. It's being disarmed by someone who never lost the thread. You were never wandering in darkness. You simply waited until the pattern revealed itself in open air, and then removed it from the root cause. Not from anger, but from clarity. Consent was misread from kindness. Truth corrected the record. They bet that gentleness would muffle every word, that courtesy would act like padding over hard facts, that soft edges would keep the furniture of their reputation from ever scraping the floor. For a stretch, the calculation held. Doubt was given room. Friction was avoided. Secrets that never belonged to one heart were carried like heavy parcels through quiet hallways, all in the name of keeping things smooth. But that wasn't harmony. It was polish on a trophy that didn't deserve the shine. And the conscience knew it. Each time silence was chosen to spare someone else's gloss, the ache returned like a reminder note on the door. Their conduct hid behind borrowed goodwill, using quiet as a cloak while habits thrived offstage. Loyalty, tenderness, even faith were counted on as guards who would never check the freight being rushed through the gate. The miscalculation arrived when the inner compass stopped spinning. The call was not to cushion egos, but to keep the ledger honest. Protecting wrongdoing by omission felt like co-signing a loan one never took. The interest kept compounding in the soul. Once that clicked, the arrangement collapsed. No more shielding people who would let others take the fall. No more bowing to fellow feeling that only bent toward convenience. Alignment, not appeasement, took the wheel. And that is when their nerves showed. Guilt could no longer be used as a leash. Counterfeit affection lost its grip. Silence was no longer a barrier they could hide behind. Choosing integrity over comfort, obedience to a higher standard over image management, justice over pretending. It rattled them, not because a score was settled, but because the message arrived steady, measured, grounded, with the certainty that comes from sacred clarity. There was no storming, no revenge. The stance itself was the statement. Fresh air will always reveal the mildew. An open window does the work a whisper never could. They expected quiet forever. Speech arrived, but not as noise, as testimony. And the mirror wasn't smashed. It was simply wiped clean, and what fell apart under the streak-free glass wasn't destroyed by hands, but by the naked truth. Calamity was bait, calm declined the hook. They rehearsed every trick to make composure crack, pressing archived buttons, unearthing tender history, slipping in sideways comments, nudging for embarrassment where others could watch. The aim wasn't pain, it was performance. If an eruption could be staged, the script they drafted would sell. There's the real character. A scene was the goal. Disorder was the tool. A villain was already drawn in the margins, waiting to be colored in. The setup was obvious. The pressure could be felt like a change in air before a storm. But steadiness held. Grounding beats theatrics. Breath outlasted bait. Restraint wasn't fear, it was precision. The moment called for a locked spine and a quiet pulse, because the end game was visible from the first cue. Refusing the shortcut into their storyline left them with pages that demanded evidence they didn't have. And that's where the turn began. A centered reply made their tactics look oddly shaped. The more poise remained, the more their plot frayed. Tones sharpened, details disagreed with each other, timelines kinked, and the rehearsal marks showed on the floor. Calmness became a reflective surface, and their own choices started writing the footnotes they didn't want anyone to read. Nothing needed to be shouted. No accusations were required. The absence of an outburst was its own analysis. What was meant to trap became an audit. The curtain they tried to drop bounced back on its counterweight, and the spotlight pivoted by the stage's own mechanics. The game wasn't joined, the board was removed, and now the glare rests where it was always heading, not by attack, but by the quiet physics of truth meeting performance. Outcome was scheduled by schemers. Providence altered it while the clock was still ticking. They drew blueprints for a collapse, quiet rumors as scaffolding, timed exits as levers, a final push aimed at the softest rib. The whole machine was built to rattle nerves and crown despair. Anticipated footage included shaking hands, sleepless eyes, a room with no doors. That was the payment they craved. Then an interruption none of them costed appeared. God reached into the sequence like a hand to a spinning top, and momentum shifted without warning. Latches thought to be sealed clicked open. Bystanders who had been coached to step away felt their footing again and turned to look twice. Heat intended to buckle the frame did something else entirely. It tempered the metal. The moment designed for unraveling became the forge. Breakdown never arrived, breakthrough did. What was buried rose on its own timetable, not because of noise, but because light refuses contracts. The confidence behind the sabotage assumed control of both setup and finish, forgetting there is an author beyond any outline, not the centerpiece in their production, marked instead for a higher assignment. Identity stood where intimidation tried to fold it. No tactic, no whisper campaign, no quiet hand on a lever can scribble out what was written in heaven's ink. While they arranged a scene to harvest humiliation, God changed the geometry. Survival would have been enough. Instead, elevation came. Recovery would have satisfied the record. Instead, transformation rewrote the record. The same arrangement meant to cage turned into stairs. Their diagram bent into a looking glass. They could not dodge. Hidden motives surfaced like ink under bright lamps. Retaliation wasn't the choice. Alignment was. They moved from pride. Purpose moved here. And the change didn't thunder in. It arrived like clear air after a pressure drop. Calm that nobody could counterfeit. Favor with no explanation. A quiet clearing of the path that can't be blocked by human hands. Now confusion sits with the architects, not merely because failure didn't happen, but because rising came without announcement. And with that rise, the watching world learned a simple rule. When God edits outcomes in real time, even the smoothest deceivers lose the steering wheel.